guys, welcome back to the Psalms to God podcast. This is your host Ree, and today we're continuing this idea of common knowledge and things that exist across cultures. So we're going to talk about the end. I know. Most people would have started at the beginning and worked their way to the end, but for some reason my brain is not working like that, and I just decided to just skip right to the end. Like, let's just jump straight to the end. And I think it's something that doesn't really surprise anyone that a lot of cultures have this concept of an end in common. We see this even in the media, even in Hollywood. There's always some kind of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic movie, whether it's from zombies or alien invasions or just, now it's common to have pandemic movies. We see like the finality of our life everywhere. And the world, everything in nature speaks to it, right? Just everything, like even like with the seasons, right? You start in spring, but you go to winter and everything's dead, and then there's like a rebirth. And we see people die, people don't live forever. So everything about our world is mortal and has some sort of end. So it makes sense that this concept appears in a lot of religious beliefs and a lot of cultures. So I wanted to dig into that and find out a little bit more about it. So that's where I started. Now, going into this, I wasn't sure exactly what I would find, because even within Christianity, if you just go across denominations, even probably within the same denomination sometimes, you will find very different ideology about what the end looks like from a Christian standpoint. It's definitely not the most pleasant thing to talk about. A lot of people don't like talking about the end. And so a lot of people don't study prophecy. It's one of my favorite areas of the word, which may be why this is the first episode of the season, or the first episode of actual content in the season. But it's something that I find fascinating, but I have noticed that a lot of people don't like to talk about it. So a lot of people don't study what's there. And so most people, myself included when I was younger, have a very shallow idea of what the end means. When I was growing up, the only thing I ever heard about the end from a Christian perspective was fire and brimstone. So I just thought fire and brimstone, like fire will be raining from the sky or something like that. And that's all I really understood. I didn't understand anything else about prophecy or anything going into it. And even as you get beyond that and people actually start reading and start finding the text, there's so much overlap, there's so much layering, there's so much symbolism and figurative language that it becomes very difficult to piece things together. You have people who believe that there will be literal beasts popping up out of the ocean and out of the land. And other people who recognize those as symbols and have interpretations for what those symbols mean. So then once you get into the interpretations, people have different interpretations of what those symbols are. So it gets very, very messy very quickly. So you can't really say that everyone within the Christian faith even has the same concept of the end of the world. But there is a definite concept that there is an end. And there are a few things that are tied or tethered throughout these different interpretations and these different beliefs that I do want to point out before we really dive in, just so that we can have some sort of foundational starting point. And so I would say that most Christians will agree that the end deals with fire. There is some sort of fire involved with the end. There is definitely the tribulation. We know that there will be suffering, that there will be pain, that there will be sickness and pestilence and famines, that there will be natural disasters like earthquakes and volcanoes or whatever. That is tied into this idea of the end times. And then of course there is this delineation that the character of man will be degraded, that you will have immoral people, that people will be very selfish, that they will be violent, that they will love evil, You will have people who are arrogant, people who are, more concerned with self, more concerned with money and greed. And that's what mankind's persona will look like at that time. There are several verses that back up these ideas. And I think that particularly, the verses that you can find in like Matthew, that where Christ is talking about the end, or verses that you can find in the New Testament before Revelation, I think those are the ones that people will be familiar with, because, like I said, some people are very scared to touch Revelation. So I think those may be some of the more commonality or common points within the Christian faith. Now, as you step away from Christianity, the next closest things, of course, are going to be within the Abrahamic religions. You have Judaism and you have Islam. And because they're all part of the Abrahamic tradition, they all, there are similarities. There, of course, are differences as well. But, even in Islam, there is still this idea that the end will see Jesus returning. With Judaism, of course, they do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, but their end is marked by, the Messiah showing up, and this idea of the restoration of Israel, and, bringing all the nations into submission to God. So there are a lot of similarities in, this concept. I think all three still have this idea of resurrecting the dead at this time, and a uniting of people who have believed and who have done the right thing, or like the reward for the good and things like that. And so that's, one of the, I guess, more popular ideas, because between Christianity, Islam, and of course Judaism, the Abrahamic faiths make up, I guess, the most commonly, I don't want to say accepted. If you did a poll and you found out what faith people were from, the Abrahamic faiths are the most popular faiths across the world, particularly in the Western Hemisphere where I am. So these are probably the ideas that most people are familiar with. But like I said, the whole idea of this podcast is to talk about how this permeates even outside of the Abrahamic faiths. So before we start talking about these other faiths and what they think about religion, I want to start out by mentioning time, because some religions see time as linear and some see it as cyclical. So because I am from a Christian faith, I typically think of time as being linear. And that means that there was a definite beginning, and of course we're moving towards an end. So time is like a line segment where you have a beginning point and you have an end point, and there's like some time connecting the beginning and the end. But there are a lot of faiths, particularly within the Eastern cultures, where time is considered cyclical, and there are different types of cycles that happen. You could call them ages or epochs or whatever you want to refer to them to. They have specific names in each culture or each religion, where it's like there is a time, there's maybe like this type of a period and these types of things happen during that period, and there is a time for that, and then that period will end, and then there will be another period, and then maybe another, and they may have 2 periods or 6 periods or 7 or whatever, and they have time divided into these different stages, and then after it goes through those stages, it repeats, kind of like how our seasons are, right? So we have 4 seasons. You have spring, summer, fall, and winter. But after winter comes spring again, right? Like you just it's like a wheel that keeps going and going and going. And so a couple of the religions that I looked at and the belief systems that I looked at have that type of a belief in time. So as we get into talking to each one, you will see that kind of a situation going on. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about when it pertains to beliefs about the end is actually not a religion at all, depending on how you define religion and depending on how you view certain things. But I wanted to include it because it is something that we're all exposed to. And there's a lot to be said about the end in relation to this particular thing. And that is science, guys. Science actually has a lot to say about the end of the world. Most apocalyptic movies are like sci-fi movies, and there's a lot of discussion about it in the science community. I personally like astronomy. I like to study astronomy, so I've read a lot about how things could happen from a astronomical type of a view. And so it's very interesting because those ideologies do, I mean, while the cause and the rationale of how and why these things happen, they actually do kind of fit in along the lines of some of the things that show up in the religion. So most of you will be familiar with the concept of a supernova. This is what happens to stars at the end of their lives. They explode. It is commonly held that the sun will eventually grow into a red giant, at which point it will expand. Its gravity will pull in the earth. The earth will be incinerated. Again, fire, right? That, all life would, of course, die at some point during this time of this expansion. And then eventually the sun would collapse in on itself in a big explosion, and our whole solar system would be destroyed, right? That's one way that science says would completely end our world. Now, another way that our world could end from a scientific point of view is from things in the heavens impacting the earth. So you have comets, asteroids, meteors, whatever. You have random debris that is floating along in the sky that could impact the earth. And if these things were to impact the earth, they would cause a massive crater, for one, yes, but it would be like a massive explosion. And of course, then the smoke from this explosion could blot out the sun, and there could just be a lot of different ramifications that would cause death and famine and all kinds of issues on the earth that could annihilate humanity. So those are some of the more, I guess, dramatic things that could happen. But then there are also things that could happen that are self-inflicted, right? Because there's this concept of randomization that comes from science, where it's like, oh, this is just how things go. It's a off chance situation or whatever. But then there's also still this idea that it's our fault, that we cause our own suffering. And so in that realm, you have things like climate change, right? Where people right now are trying to do things to prevent climate change or to slow climate change. And so you could say that, again, the overheating of the planet, melting of the polar ice caps, greedy usage of resources and misusage of resources. If you watch any of the documentaries on Netflix about how we are polluting our planet, you will see that people, like companies dumping waste into our water, us polluting the ocean, all of these things are impacting our planet, and of course could cause massive consequences for human life on the planet. And so that's one way that the world could end from a scientific standpoint. And then, of course, you have like war, because apparently we as human beings are super violent and like to attack each other. If there was ever a nuclear war, we would definitely destroy ourselves. That's one of the fears that people have. I think that's also one of the reasons that World War III has not broken out, because we are very aware that we could annihilate ourselves very quickly. So that is a lot of the scientific way that we could end up in an end of the world scenario. Now that we've gotten the science behind it, or the science idea out of the way, let's look into some different religions around the world and what they think. So the first religion we're going to look at is Hinduism. And Hinduism is one of those religions that has kind of this idea of cycles and like a cyclical view of time where things will repeat themselves or periods will repeat themselves. And forgive me in advance if I mispronounce any of these things because I'm not an expert on pronunciation. But Hinduism has this belief in what they call Yuga cycles, and they have 4 of them. And the entire concept behind these cycles is that mankind is descending from pure and purity into chaos, which again, it's not that far off from the idea of starting in the garden where you're in a perfect state and then descending into madness at the apocalypse, right? There are similarities in the underlying belief system there. And one of the cycles, the final cycle, is called Kali Yuga or something like that. And that is the cycle that we are believed to be in from a Hindu perspective. That is the 4th cycle where you're in the worst state, you're descending into absolute chaos. And again, moral decay and people are, not at their best behavior. And of course, their cycles are all labeled with specific times. I don't remember the exact number of years that are supposed to be in each cycle, but they have so many years that are supposed to be in the cycle so they can say like this cycle starts here and ends here and all of these types of predictions. And so from their belief, I think this Kali Yuga, this final period of descending into chaos, was supposed to have begun in about 3000-ish BC, and it's supposed to end in some sort of cataclysm that is supposed to take you back to this first cycle, which would have been a pure cycle. And again, like I said, that's not that far off in terms of underlying beliefs of the Christian view of we start in Eden and then we descend into, destruction and sinfulness. And then at the end, everything is destroyed and then recreated into a new Garden of Eden, right? It's still kind of this concept of going back to this stage of purity. So that is what Hinduism believes in terms of where we are in time and where we're going in time. Now, another religion that is also has this kind of cyclical view is Jainism. So Jainism has this idea that there are 2 cycles. I want to think there are sub-cycles within the cycles, but essentially they have ascending time and descending time. And ascending and descending, again, still has to do with the morality and the positivity that's happening in the world. So the ascending time cycle is a time of good, a time of prosperity, a time of happiness. And the descending time cycle is about sorrow and pain, and, immorality. And so they have these 2 things. They're divided. There are names for them. I will put those names in the show notes. I'm not even going to try to pronounce these because I will definitely butcher them. But we are said to be in that descending time cycle according to Jain belief. So again, everybody is recognizing that we're in some sort of state of moral decay, and that we're obviously experiencing sorrow. You'd have to be blind to not look at the world and see that there's pain and suffering and sorrow happening, which is why pretty much everybody is putting us in this state of time where, there is a decay. And so from the Jain perspective, again, you have a series of events or a series of, things that happen within each of these time blocks. And once, once we finish the descent, it spins around and you end up back in this time of ascension. And I think, again, there is some sort of event or cataclysm that is supposed to mark the transition from one state to the other state. Okay, so I also want to take a step back and look at some of the beliefs that were around in Europe before Christianity, and also, I guess, during Christianity. As Europe was being Christianized, you had various different religious beliefs that were happening at that time as well. And one of those was that of the Norse people, which would be over near like Germany and stuff like that. And you guys are going to be really familiar kind of with this concept because it's, heavily played upon in like the Marvel movies and Marvel world and the cinematic universe. So you're going to know this word as soon as I say it. You're going to have heard it, but you may not know that it is in conjunction with the Norse view of the end of the world. And that is Ragnarok, right? Of course, there's a movie called Ragnarok, right? But that was their idea of the end of the world. Ragnarok is essentially the same concept as apocalypse or Armageddon or something like that. And it means the fate of the gods. So in Norse ideology, there was this idea that there would be some sort of cataclysm, that there would be all of these, events, and some of their gods, like, of course, within that realm, you have like Loki and Thor and, all of this stuff. And some of them would die in this cataclysm, but some would survive. And there's this idea that the earth would be kind of like reborn and recreated. And in this recreation, there would be 2 human survivors. And those human survivors, along with whatever gods survive, would be repopulating the planet. So again, this kind of concept of a reset and going back to the beginning, going back to the initial state of the world. Again, this idea of rebirth and rejuvenation is surrounded there. And of course, it's heralded by a period of unrest, a period of natural disasters and turmoil within our current state. Now, one of the marked differences between the concept of Ragnarok and the Norse belief and the Christian belief is that they believe that the earth would be submerged in water. So that basically there would be this flood. And of course, from a Christian perspective, we believe that God will not flood the earth again, that Yahweh has promised not to flood the earth. So that's one of the stark contrasts where Ragnarok deals with kind of like a water end, and Christian ideology and of course science ideology has more of a fiery end to the world. But this concept is still there. And I found it very interesting that this concept of the earth being repopulated by 2 human beings, it really does take you back to this idea of the garden and Adam and Eve and, only being 2 people. So I found that interesting because I had never really looked at it from, outside of like a Marvel movie. I had never really paid that much attention to it. So I thought that was an interesting take on what will happen in the end. So if we keep going farther back in time, before Christianity, before, the Abrahamic religions really took off, there was this concept of Zoroastrianism. And this is a predecessor of Judaism, where it is considered one of the first monotheistic religions to exist. Now, I do want to insert here, because a lot of people get confused when you start talking about religions and ages of religions. And that's kind of part of what I want to be bringing out in this series about common knowledge is that, you had Adam and Eve, and Judaism didn't start until, basically Jacob's sons of Israel. But you had Abraham starting the Abrahamic religions. But he didn't just make up a religion all on his own, right? He was continuing something that he was already believing in. And when you read the story of Abraham, you see him interact with, other people. There's a priest, the priest of Salem. There is, Moses' father-in-law who believes in the same things. Later, there are other people worshiping the Most High God. And I wanted to point that out as I started talking about Zoroastrianism, because I want to point out that just because it predates Judaism doesn't really mean what people try to make it mean, if that makes any sense. Like, all of these things are continuations of a belief that started with Adam and Eve and kept going from my Christian point of view, is that different religions have pieces of truth because they're all coming from the same starting point. And that's why I want to highlight these similar ideologies, these fundamental beliefs that we have in common, that I think are basically what I'm calling common knowledge across cultures. That's what I want to throw in. But Zoroastrianism is still based heavily in this concept of a battle of good and evil, a resurrection of the dead, and this concept of the wicked being punished and permanently killed and things like that. So that was their belief, which, like I said, mirrors a lot of the Abrahamic faiths and the Abrahamic traditions. There may actually be even more beliefs out there. I definitely did come across different things, especially if you start looking into like cult religions. Like they've already had a couple of you had like the mass suicide in Jonestown, and you have people who are waiting for like a UFO to come take them and things like that. I didn't want to get into those too deeply, but they are out there, so I'm mentioning them because they do exist. But essentially, most cultures have some idea that there is going to be some sort of cataclysmic event. We're all in agreement that our world is in a state of moral decay. But we also all seem to have this belief that that's not just normal human nature, and that there is something better. There is some sort of pure or holy or positive environment that could exist. We all have this concept of like this Eden-like time or period or place that we're trying to get to, and whether we have a belief that we're going to get there and stay in that state forever, or whether we have an idea that we're going to get there and spend some time there and then descend again, it is slightly varying from religion to religion. But there is that idea. And even from our linear view in Christianity, it's not really the end. It's more so the end of this time period. And we just don't have that much information about what happens after, right? It's like, oh, we're going to go back into a state of peace, a state of Eden, but we don't know what will happen next. And so I think it's interesting that we're all kind of pointing back towards Eden, and it's just some of us are saying, yeah, that's the end of our knowledge, and other people are like, yeah, and then it's going to happen over and over again. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to look into and to study, and that it's been really fun just to see these different things and how they are similar at the core. Like I said, if you start getting into details, we're definitely going to have different ideologies. But that is pretty much all I have for today's episode. I hope that it has been enlightening, and I encourage you to look deeper into it if you are interested. As always, I will put some information in the show notes, and I will definitely write out some of these words that I have probably butchered, and the words that I chose not to speak out loud because I know I'm going to butcher them. I'll also try to put in some links for references from where I was studying about these things. And I hope you have a blessed week. I will see you again next week. And before we end the episode, I do want to say, if there is a topic that you are interested in hearing about, or that you think is common across cultures and you want to hear me talk about it, You can always feel free to message me. You can reach me on the blog or on Instagram, www.psalmstogod.com, or at psalms_to_God on Instagram. And you can always leave me a message, and I will try to find information on that and present that topic as well. So, like I said, have a good week. See you again. Bye.